Murmansk Convoys, floating coffins. The German officer's words carried a cruel certainty, the kind that echoed through the U-boat pens at Brest and Bergen. In their minds, the Arctic route was not a supply line but a slaughterhouse. Every merchant ship that dared to carry fuel, tanks, and munitions north was little more than prey, lumbering across a frozen graveyard where wolf packs waited with steel jaws open. Beneath the black surface of the Barents Sea, U-boats drifted silently, listening. The Arctic winter cloaked everything in endless night. On the surface, waves heaved like mountains, breaking into sleet that froze as it landed. And hidden beneath, submarines prowled, 3,500 tons of steel and torpedoes gliding through the cold. To their commanders, the math was simple. The convoy could not possibly reach Murmansk intact, but above those same waters, a different picture unfolded. A column of merchant ships forced its way north, engines groaning against the heavy swell. Hulls groaned under the weight of ice, decks slick and brittle with frozen spray. Men in thick sheepskin coats chipped at railings with hammers, fighting the frost that threatened to capsize them before the enemy even arrived. Searchlights cut arcs across the night, their beams lost in the blizzard haze. The convoy was alive with sound, the thrum of diesel engines, the crack of ice breaking, the weary shouts of men who had not seen the sun in weeks. On the bridge of a British destroyer, an officer peered into the void, binoculars rimmed with frost. Somewhere out there, he knew, torpedoes waited. The Arctic gave no comfort. It numbed hands and hearts alike. Still, every man aboard understood what rode in their holds: food for starving Leningrad, tanks for the Eastern Front, fuel for Soviet offensives. Without these supplies, Russia might falter. And if Russia faltered, the war itself could shift. Far below, inside a U-boat's control room, red lamps glowed over sweat-slick faces. The commander listened to the hydrophone, where faint propeller beats pulsed like a heartbeat through the deep. A slow smile crept across his face. Another convoy, another massacre. His crew shared his confidence. This was familiar work, a deadly game they believed they had already mastered. Yet what neither side knew in that frozen hour was that the balance had begun to change. The hunters believed they had cornered helpless prey. But these convoys, scarred by past disasters, had teeth now, destroyers bristling with depth charges, aircraft ranging farther than ever before, and sonar whispering secrets through the dark. The German officer's sneer would soon be tested. For in the Arctic night, the prey was ready to bite back. The night closed in like a suffocating blanket, the convoy a trail of ghostly silhouettes pressing through the Arctic black. The men on deck had long since stopped feeling their fingers. The cold was so complete, so absolute that it gnawed at bone. Their breaths crystallized into tiny clouds that dissolved instantly into the biting wind. Engines rumbled below decks, the sound muted by layers of ice that now coated the hulls. Somewhere in the vastness, eyes were watching, waiting. Then the lookout saw it, faint streaks in the water, silvery trails cutting straight toward the line of freighters. Someone shouted, his voice cracked by the gale, "Torpedoes!" A heartbeat later, the sea erupted. Steel buckled and screamed. The first freighter took a hit amidships, fire gushing upward as oil ignited on the waves. A second struck near the stern of another vessel, tearing it in half like paper. The blast hurled sailors into the freezing sea before they even understood they were dead men. The night became a cacophony. Alarms shrieked across the convoy. Sirens wailed. Whistles blew frantic signals into the storm. Merchant sailors, eyes wide, scrambled to lower lifeboats, their ropes iced over and stiff. Some boats crashed against the sides, spilling men into black water that swallowed them without a sound. The Arctic gave no mercy. 10 minutes in that sea, and the strongest heart stopped beating. Radio operators hammered keys, frantic SOS bursts crackling into the ether. Convoy under attack! Torpedoes in the water! Sparks lit the sky as masts snapped and cables ripped loose. The convoy shuddered under the first strike of the wolves. Destroyers peeled out of line, surging into the dark. Men dropped depth charges by instinct, their crews hardened by a dozen drills. The first charges fell with hollow splashes before vanishing beneath the waves. Then came the thunder. A rolling, gut-deep roar tore upward through the water, slamming into hulls, shaking rivets in their sockets. The ocean boiled white as the charges detonated. Somewhere below, a U-boat crew clenched their jaws, teeth rattling as their steel coffin shuddered. Above, the merchant ships fought back with what they had. Gunners at makeshift stations swung anti-aircraft weapons toward the void, firing blindly into nothing. Tracers cut streaks of red across the sky, their only enemy the dark itself. The wind whipped snow into their faces, ice clung to their gloves, but they fired anyway. Anything to keep fear at bay. A young sailor clutched the frozen rail of a burning freighter, his knuckles white against the frost. Flames licked the deck around him, yet each wave that crashed overboard was colder than fire, dousing embers and drenching his body. He gasped with each icy slap, smoke and steam rising together as the Arctic Sea clawed at him. Somewhere behind him, men screamed for lifeboats. Somewhere ahead, another explosion cracked the night in two. Inside one of the Predators, a very different scene unfolded. The red glow of lamps cast long shadows across sweating faces. The commander stood, headphones pressed tight to his skull, listening to the hydrophone's ghostly thrum. Propeller beats filled the room, steady and strong, dozens of ships, dozens of targets. He smiled. "The convoy is finished," he muttered, his German clipped but confident. Around him, the crew grinned in the half-dark. Torpedoes slid into steel tubes, greased hands shoving the long weapons into place. Valves hissed, levers locked. A petty officer barked commands as the boat tilted, lining up for another shot. It was cramped, suffocating work, but to them it was routine, a deadly trade they had mastered. Sweat ran down necks despite the chill. The smell of oil and unwashed bodies mixed with the metallic tang of the sea. The U-boat shuddered as another salvo was fired. The commander leaned against the periscope, watching faint flashes on the horizon. He imagined the panic above, merchant sailors scattering like startled deer, escorts dropping charges in desperation. He knew those tricks. He'd seen them before. None of it mattered. Convoys were lumbering beasts, blind in the dark. All they had to do was circle, bite, and circle again until nothing remained. Above them, in the storm, another merchant ship erupted into fire. The sky turned orange for a fleeting moment before the wind snuffed it out, leaving only smoke and screams carried on the gale. The convoy wavered, yet still pressed forward, its escorts darting like nervous shepherd dogs around a herd that bled into the sea. But the wolves pressed harder. More U-boats closed in, their positions carefully shadowing the convoy from both sides. Chatter over radios and hydrophones echoed their confidence. The noose was tightening. In their minds, it was only a matter of hours now. The prey would sink, one ship at a time, until nothing but oil slicks and lifeboats marked where the convoy had dared to pass. The men above could not know it, but far beneath the surface, the hunters were already celebrating. The storm had not let up. Snow lashed across the decks, thick as smoke, and the sea rolled black and merciless beneath the convoy. Yet in that blizzard, a subtle rhythm pulsed, a sound so faint that only the trained could hear it. the steady ping of sonar bouncing through the deep. Where once the Allies had been nearly blind, now they could see with sound. On the bridge of HMS Scimitar, a destroyer leading the screen, a young lieutenant leaned over the sonar operator's shoulder. Each metallic echo came back faster, sharper, betraying shapes that once could hide forever in the dark. "Bearing steady," the operator muttered, sweat beading despite the cold. "She's down there, sir." A new edge sharpened in Allied voices now, no longer fear of the unseen, but confidence that the unseen could finally be found. For months the Germans had laughed at the convoy escorts, their primitive charges and fruitless chases. But this night was different. Alongside sonar, new radar sets swept the waves, picking out faint silhouettes where none should be. And bolted to the decks were weapons never before unleashed in the Arctic night, the Hedgehog mortars, clusters of spigot bombs that arced forward into the sea, detonating only if they struck steel. The old depth charges had been like blind fists thrown into the dark. Hedgehogs were knives, precise and lethal. Above, the sky itself had changed. The air gap, that cursed stretch of ocean too far for land-based aircraft to cover, had closed. The deep-throated engines of consolidated B-24 Liberators droned overhead, their long wings bristling with radar sets and depth charges. The wolf packs had once prowled that gap with impunity. Now, every hour, those hunters risked becoming prey themselves. Deep in his U-boat, Captain Lieutenant Werner Hausfeld had not realized this yet. He stood in the red gloom of the control room, head tilted toward the hydrophone hum. Torpedo runs had gone well. 2 ships were down. But then the sounds changed. Depth charges fell with unnatural accuracy, slamming closer with every roll. His first officer frowned. "They shouldn't know where we are." Hausfeld ignored him, but unease gnawed at the edges of his pride. Something had shifted in this hunt. The Allies struck first blood. Sonar pings grew faster, their echoes sharpening like knives closing in. A corvette, HMS Snowflake, lunged forward, spray breaking over her bow. "Target acquired," the sonar man called voice taut. The captain didn't hesitate. "Fire, hedgehogs!" the deck erupted. Dozens of small projectiles arced out in a fan, splashing into the waves ahead. For an instant, there was silence. Then a dull, crushing roar from beneath, the unmistakable thud of steel being torn apart under pressure. The crew cheered as the sea convulsed, air bubbles and oil belching to the surface. Somewhere below, 45 men were sealed in a tomb of iron. Elsewhere, HMS Bulldog stalked her own shadow. The sonar trace was faint, skittering, but steady enough. Depth charges thundered, rolling the ship itself with each detonation. For 10 minutes the chase continued. Then a shape burst from the Black Sea, a U-boat forced to the surface, her conning tower shredded, water gushing through her decks. Allied searchlights blazed white against the storm, catching the frantic figures scrambling topside. Men threw themselves into the sea rather than wait for the end. Others raised their arms in surrender. The escorts opened fire only long enough to silence the deck gun before watching, grimly, as the submarine slipped under the waves for good. The wolf pack staggered. What had begun as a confident assault now fractured under relentless counterattack. Each U-boat commander had drilled his men to expect lumbering escorts, blind strikes, chaos they could exploit. But the Allies were no longer blind. They were precise, ruthless, coordinated. Each ping, each radar sweep, each mortar salvo tightened the jaws around the hunters. Above, the long-winged Liberators appeared through a gap in the storm. Their engines thundered like heralds of doom. One U-boat, surfacing to recharge batteries, was caught in their glare. A bomb bay opened. Depth charges fell in a neat pattern, walking across the sea until the submarine vanished in a column of spray. Survivors clung briefly to wreckage before the Arctic swallowed them whole. Inside another U-boat, panic replaced pride. Valves hissed as water poured into a ruptured bulkhead. The crew fought in silence broken only by shouted orders. "Seal compartment! Pumps to maximum!" Men scrambled with wrenches, their breath fogging the air, eyes wide with dread. The commander gripped the periscope handles but saw nothing now, only the swirl of lights above and the deadly certainty of sonar in his ears. The war had turned in a single night, and he knew it. The wolf pack tried to scatter, each submarine diving deep, hoping the storm would cloak them. But the Allies pressed, destroyers weaving back and forth, sonar sweeping tirelessly. Charges rained into the sea. The discipline of the Germans, once unshakable, fractured under terror. One commander broke radio silence, begging for orders. Another surfaced too early and was caught in a blinding beam of searchlights, guns hammering his deck to ruin. Above it all, the convoy pressed forward, battered but alive. Fires smoldered on the sea where oil burned atop waves. Lifeboats bobbed like corks among the wreckage. Yet in the heart of the column, the merchant ships still churned on, prows splitting the ice, engines groaning but steady. Men clung to the hope that for once the Arctic graveyard would not claim them all. By dawn, the wolves were gone, scattered, limping, some never to return. The convoy carried its scars into the pale light, masts broken, decks scorched. But the line held. Supplies still steamed toward Murmansk. Behind them, the frozen sea was littered with wreckage, some theirs, but more belonging to the hunters who had believed the prey defenseless. The German officer's sneer seemed hollow now, for in that black Arctic night the prey had bitten back, and the wolves had tasted fear. The convoy limped into Murmansk beneath a sky the color of iron. The sun was little more than a faint glow along the horizon, smothered by Arctic haze, but to the men on deck it felt like dawn after an endless night. Their ships were scarred, steel plates warped from near misses, lifeboats gone, decks scorched and blackened, yet they had made it. The columns of smoke that once trailed the burning freighters were gone now, left behind in the frozen sea, replaced with the grinding sound of ice against hulls as they entered the harbor. Onshore, Soviet dockworkers waited, bundled in fur and heavy coats, their breath fogging in the bitter air. They shouted and waved as the first merchant vessels eased against the piers. Cranes swung slowly into motion, cables lowering to pluck crates from the holds. The loads were not just wood and steel, they were lifelines, tanks, trucks, fuel, food, the sinews of war for an army that had bled for 3 years without rest. Red stars painted on flat cars stood ready to carry the supplies deeper inland, eastward to where entire fronts depended on them. The sailors aboard the convoy ships stood at their rails, hollow-eyed with fatigue. Some raised gloved hands in return. Others leaned silently, staring into the frozen water where too many of their shipmates had vanished. Relief hung in the air, but it was laced with grief. For every ship that reached the docks, another had gone down in the storm and fire, and the men who had manned them were gone to the sea forever. The cheers of welcome mingled with a silence heavy as the Arctic itself, joy and mourning bound together in the same breath. Far away, deep in the heart of Germany, the news of the convoy's survival arrived like a blow. At the headquarters of the U-boat arm, Admiral Dönitz studied the reports with a grim frown. Several submarines had not returned. Messages from the survivors spoke of relentless escort attacks, of sonar that tracked them like a hunter's hound, of depth charges that fell not in blind barrages, but in surgical, deadly precision. Aircraft, once a distant threat, had arrived where none should have flown, raining destruction even in the storm's heart. The wolf pack had not triumphed, it had been mauled. In the officers' mess, men who had once boasted of convoys destroyed sat in silence. The happy time, as they had called it, those years when merchant ships had gone down like ripe fruit, was slipping away. The enemy had adapted. The prey now carried weapons sharp enough to pierce the wolves' hides. A few captains muttered excuses about weather, about luck, about numbers. But beneath the surface of their words, all knew the truth. The Atlantic and the Arctic would never again belong to them so easily. For the Allies, the meaning of this single convoy went beyond Murmansk's docks. It was proof that sacrifice bought survival. Without the Arctic convoys, the Soviet armies might have withered, their tanks stilled for lack of fuel, their guns silent for want of shells. Each ship that braved the frozen sea carried not only supplies but the future of the war itself. The men who chipped ice from rails, who stood sleepless at the guns, who went into the black waves with lifeboat ropes in their hands, they bore more than cargo. They bore the weight of an alliance, the promise that nations far apart could bleed together for victory. To endure the Arctic was to stare into the very edge of human limits. The cold cut flesh like knives, the storms smashed ships as though they were toys, and always the unseen threat waited beneath. Yet still the convoys sailed. They sailed because to stop was to surrender, and to surrender was to lose not only ships but everything they fought for. As the last crates rolled off the decks in Murmansk, the men allowed themselves a moment of rest. Some collapsed into hammocks, still wearing ice-crusted coats. Others gathered on deck, speaking softly of the friends they had lost. There was no triumph here, no easy glory. There was only survival, carved from the jaws of the Arctic and from the wolves who had circled in vain. The legacy of those nights at sea would not be measured only in cargo unloaded or ships sunk. It would be measured in the way the war bent because of them, in Soviet tanks that rolled with American fuel, in Red Army soldiers who fought with rifles stamped in British factories, in the simple fact that the Eastern Front did not collapse. It would be measured in the knowledge that human endurance, stretched to breaking point, had held. The German officer's sneer, the one that had mocked Murmansk convoys as floating coffins, seemed far away now, swallowed by the reality of the frozen sea. The coffins had not been for the convoys. They had been for the hunters themselves. And when the history of that brutal winter was written, the final line was not of defeat, but of survival. The hunters had circled, certain of slaughter. But when the smoke cleared, it was the convoy, scarred yet alive, that had written history in the frozen sea.